next time. Uh-oh, there's Abby. I don't remember what color it was. Do you guys remember? Mine is yellow, but I don't know what color yours is. Blue, okay. Long, long ago. I remember. The poem we're going to look at for this. Abby, at the beginning of class, we just played a game tip. So sorry I didn't let you in, but I know. Okay, if you don't have it today, that's okay. I'm hoping one person finds it so that kind of reminds everybody of what it is. Oh, it's in the poetry packet this year. Did you throw away your poetry packet? No. Okay, sorry, I remember now.
Oh.
Okay, so carry it around with you, Allison? So good. Okay, I've got a couple extras here, so you guys can look at the words.
Oh, so
Actually, whose is this? I have somebody's. Whose handwriting is that? Is that yours? Well, it's too nice.
oh, shoot. Yours. Just go.
Whose is this? It could be the other class, I guess. Okay, well, you have the definitions here. You guys over you. You guys can kind of look around. So there, it's the blue pages. Does that one have any? Thought it was. Maybe this is just an old one. Nope, that's all right. So bring that next time. But it's fine for today. Let's look at this poem I just gave you and kind of go through the piece, like go through the process of what you could do. Now, we're going to go through it super slowly. The hard part about the AP test, like obviously, is the timed element to it. The fact that you have to come up with these ideas immediately and just start writing. I get why they have to do it that way, to kind of like determine a student's understanding and ensure that they're not cheating and whatever. They have to have some kind of time limit, but also this is the only time in your life when anyone is ever going to say, analyze a poem in 40 minutes. That's crazy. No English class in college will ever ask you to do that. So it is like the one kind of false part about this test. Okay, so let's just read the prompt first. The prompt says the following poem is by a contemporary poet. Yeah, sorry. Nope. Lee Young Lee. Read the poem carefully, then write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how the poet conveys the complex relationship of the father and son through the use of literary devices such as point of view and structure. So it sounds very much like the prompts for the short passage essays. Like they'll give you a little bit of direction to go, like analyze the relationship between the characters. Honestly, sometimes that is just like, Nick, do you have one poem? Oh, Octavia, will you pass one of those green poems back to Nick? You do have two, right? Yeah, okay. So sometimes that is just like a little bit of help for you to understand what the poem is about at all, because sometimes these poems are a little bit like vague. And so they'll say something like, oh, you know, think about the religious significance of this poem, or think about like how this poet feels for the one on Friday, like think about how this poet feels about his past or whatever. They'll give you like a little hint, but what they are always asking you to do on all three essays is tell them about the theme. So they want to see that you can not only say something about the relationship between the two characters, but also what kind of like, again, truth about human nature is sort of revealed in the poem. And and what you're looking for is something that could be interesting to read in that theme, right? Like we're looking for not just, oh, relationships between sons and fathers can be hard. We're looking for something like really interesting to say about the poem that maybe not everybody else will say. At the same time, we want to balance it and not try to say things that aren't proven by the language in the poem. You got to be able to back it up with evidence, right? So sometimes the danger with poetry is to be like, I think this is actually a poem about communism, you know, like trying to find like this deep secret hidden meaning. And that we don't want the meaning to be secret. We just want it to be interesting and complex, you know? So let's read it now. Oh, and then the literary devices, they'll kind of give you something that you could talk about. Like here it says point of view and structure. All right, that's cool. You can talk about those things, but those are so broad. Point of view is talking about narration here. That's very broad. And structure is talking about like everything else with poetry, you know, meter, stanzas, in this case, like the italics versus the not italicized words, rhyme, all of that counts under structure. So they'll give you some hints about things you can look for, but you are meant to be more specific about those things. So here's the poem, a story. Sad is the man who asked for a story and can't come up with one. His 5-year-old son waits in his lap. Not the same story, Baba, a new one. The man rubs his chin, scratches his ear. In a room full of books and a world of stories, he can recall not one, and soon, he thinks, the boy will give up on his father. Already the man lives far ahead. He sees the day his boy will go, don't go, hear the alligator story, the angel story once more. You love the spider story, you laugh at the spider, tell me it. But the boy is packing his shirts. He is looking for his keys. Are you a god, the man screams, that I sit mute before you? Am I a god that I should never disappoint? But the boy is here. Please, Baba, a story? It is an emotional rather than a logical equation, an earthly rather than heavenly one, which posits that a boy's supplications and a father's love add up to silence. So I think this would be a nice poem for you guys to get. I think there's a lot to say here. I love that it's contemporary. Sometimes those are a bit easier to talk about. The first thing to look for always, and write this down on your paper, because we're going to use this for like just write it as notes and annotate this. We're going to use this for studying purposes. Very first thing to look for, because this is always in every poem, is imagery. So number one, look for imagery in the poem. And this can be big scenes that explore the setting, or it can be scenes that like little small pieces of imagery, like the man rubbing his chin and scratching his ear. Like this counts as a kind of like imagistic moment, right? So first thing you can always look for is imagery. Since we're in a timed situation, it's kind of nice to have a list of things to look for so that you can just say, well, I can always write about imagery, you know, and just kind of go into it knowing you're going to write about that. So find one instance, one image in this poem that you find interesting and write to the side what you notice about that little instance of imagery. All right, it is great to talk about one image, but so let's say it's me, and I noticed this idea of the boy packing his shirts and looking for his keys. It's awesome to find one image to write about. It's even better if you can find a kind of pattern in the images. So if I'm looking at the boy packing his shirt and looking for his keys, I also want to look and see if there's anywhere else in the story where someone seems distracted. because that's kind of this sign of the little boy being distracted and not listening to the father. I mean, he's not a little boy anymore. He's kind of like grown up now. But I want to look and see if there's anywhere else in the poem where someone seems distracted that I can like talk about this imagery of people being distracted and not listening to each other. And I kind of think already the man lives far ahead kind of shows me that same sort of imagery there, like him like moving into the future and not paying attention to the moment, the same way the son is as he's packing his shirt and looking for his keys. So I want to find those like kind of patterns, see if the image that you noticed has any kind of pattern in the poem where you could connect it to another image in the poem. Draw a little line between them if you do. It might not happen, but if it can, that's even better. Okay, so it's a great idea to look for imagery. If there are any symbols, similes, or metaphors, it's a great idea to look for those too. Check, I didn't see any similes or metaphors in this. Check, you guys check though, maybe I missed it. Look and see if there's any similes or metaphors. I guess the equation is kind of. Okay, so just to be clear, on the side of the poem, write down this imagery, metaphors, similes. Look for any symbolism and look for any personification. Yeah, Ash.
Would a metaphor be like or the last little part where it says that a boy's supplications out of silence?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking it would be like, it talks about how it's an equation, it's an emotional equation, and here's like the kind of like, it's like a math metaphor, I guess. Yeah, I might call that even an extended metaphor because it goes through multiple lines. Okay, I want you guys to tell each other now about the imagery that you found in the poem. What did you find? What's standing out to you? Actually, you know what? Let's backtrack for a second. Tell each other what the plot of this poem is. What is happening in the poem? Talk to each other.
One day I'm reading.
Okay, tell me, what do you think it's about? Just literally, what's happening in the poem?
His son asks him for a story. He can't come up with one. And he's like, "Oh, I can't give him a story." Like he leaves.
Yeah, he's like, okay, so his son is just like, tell me a new story, and he's like, oh my gosh, I've read so many stories, and he like starts to panic. It feels like I have read so many books, like in a room full of books in a world of stories, I can't think of a single story, and this means that my son is going to give up on me. Like my little son is going to be like, well, I guess my dad's a failure, and the father immediately then like goes into the future, and he's like, oh my gosh, someday the boy is going to be leaving home, and I'm going to be like, please stay, like I've got stories, I will tell you stories, I will give you what you want, like don't leave. And the boy's already packing up, headed off to college or whatever, and he says, are you a god? The man screams, that I sit mute before you. So it's sort of like you are passing like so much judgment on me and not listening to my prayers to you. And then he's like, am I a god that I should not disappoint? Why are you punishing me for this one time when you were a kid and I couldn't tell you stories? And then it says, Oh, but the boy is here. Oh yeah. I got to go back into this moment. Please, Baba, a story. And it says it's an emotional equation rather than a logical equation that posits that a boy's supplications and a father's love can add up to silence. So it's this way that when your child is asking you for something, it's immediately putting you in this like very emotional state where it's like, I want to give this kid the world. It is terrifying that I can't give him everything that he wants. And no matter what, I'm going to be like this big disappointment. Like it sends him into this anxious spiral that all stems from like love of the son. Right? So it's like this, like, I do think it's like a little bit of a funny poem. Maybe it's not meant to be like hilarious or anything, but it is a little bit funny how like even this tiny request from his son makes him like so nervous about disappointing his kid. And it's just a sign of his love, you know? And yet what ends up happening is that they're silent to each other because because the father is so anxious. The theme of this might be something like, hey, maybe live in the moment, don't worry about it so much, you know? I mean, there's lots of themes, but yeah. Okay, so the images that you found interesting, what are a couple images that you felt like really fit with that meaning of the poem? Ash?
I did the lines of the boy is he's looking for his
Yeah,
it's really basic, but it shows that like the father's thinking of the sleeping. And you can tell that he's grown up because he's like,
yeah.
like little kids don't have their
Good. So that word his repeated twice, right? His shirts, his keys is significant there. So you could talk about how you could in your essay, you could point out the word his and you could say, this is signs that the father is looking into the future and that the boy, because he's gained his own independence and owns his own objects, is not so reliant on the father anymore, not somebody who sits in his father's lap anymore. Okay, what other images stood out to you? Isaac?
Just kind of like, it's like the first like flash forward moment. It's just like I can see like the old guys like standing on the porch. It's like, don't go, come back and hear the alligator story and all that.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, that's kind of like an interesting image, like, you know, just like juxtapose like right there with him just being like, oh, I can't think of a story right now. And then he's like, but this is like gonna happen like immediately.
That's super interesting because it seems like he can think of a lot of stories in the future.
Yeah.
He's like the alligator story, the spider story, the angel story. Like there's so many different stories that I can tell you. Why don't you stay? So these images, like in that case, it might be the multiple images, like the alligator, the angel, the spider, like the fact that he can list all these different images that provide some irony in that moment. Okay, what other images stand out to you? Allison? Okay, where's the religious stuff?
this is like angel.
Okay, good. What stands out to you about that religious imagery here? Why do you think it's important?
The father asking like, are you a god? And God like separate them.
Yeah, okay, good. So it's like when he is so desperate to tell this perfect story to his kid, when he is so desperate to like appease the kid, then he kind of goes down here and he's sort of recognizes that was folly. Like, oh, am I a god or are you a god? No, it's not. We're not gods. And he's kind of like yelling. You imagine him like yelling at his adult son saying that, you know, and yet in the scene, the whole sort of tension of the scene is that he wants to be perfect. So it's another like ironic moment, I think, there. Okay, so do you see how when you find the image, you don't just want to say, okay, here is what this image looks like here is like what this image means. Here's what the plot is. You also want to dig into the language of that image and say what its purpose is for the theme. So like, I really loved when Ash was talking about his shirts, his keys, really pointing out those individual words and saying why those are adding to the image. So choose one word in your image and circle it, the image that you chose. Circle that one word and write down the connotations and denotations of that word. So what does that word mean? You won't have a chance for a dictionary on the test, but write down what that word is, what it actually means, and then write down the atmosphere associated with that word or the tone associated with that word. Connotations. When have you heard that word? People use that word maybe, or in what situations is that word used? Oh, Abby, let me get you up home. Okay, so let's say that I am looking at that same packing his shirts, looking for his keys moment. If I were to just look at that word packing and I'm kind of thinking of the connotations of that word, I'm like, okay, we use packing when we're talking about these transitional moments, but usually packing is seen as this very emotional affair, like, oh, you're packing up your belongings to leave. Like that's very sad thing, like in this change. And yet in this one, he's like anticipating that it's going to be very neutral and like just sort of like callous. So I tried to use that in this little observation here. I say the poet uses the word packing. He references the painful situation when his son will inevitably leave home. I messed up, like I should say the father here. I don't know. The poet uses the persona, uses the word, but I'll fix that. Anyway, will inevitably leave home. In this transitional moment, he feels abandonment, but the son remains neutral. So I'm trying to just look at that one word and the effects of that one word. And you could do that with multiple words in the image. And then you've got a nice little paragraph about imagery, you know? So one thing I want you to notice is even when I quote just one word, I'm still putting it in quotation marks because you're still focusing on why the poet is using that one word. All right, so that's it for imagery. The next thing to look for, I think as a good idea, as a good rule of thumb would be just characters, characterization. I think we get a little bit caught up on the poetic devices and we forget that poems are also telling stories. So if you can look for diction that supports character descriptions, characterization, diction that supports relationships between characters, and look for narration style that could help support who those characters are too. So look if it's first person or third person, look how the narrator feels about the characters and so on. So for this one, I'm going to have you talk together, and while you're talking, make notes on your own poem. What do you think you could say about the characterization in this poem? Okay, talk together about it. What could you say about who these characters are and their relationship to each other?
Like the little one. The transition from there to his life. He's like waiting. Yeah. We should launch like first word.
No, our moms will cry so hard.
Yeah. No.
That makes me
Real.
think.
Like a traditional kind of family. No, families are transitional where. So maybe there's that. No,
Like,
like,
the boy
later,
wants something.
the boys.
I think it kind of
like,
puts the- Puts the father like down. Because the meaning one thing is love the son, which is like, oh, I'm telling you a story like you, it's right. I remember that.
Is a
And
man.
then it like flip
wrapped
flops
up
and he's
your-
like, the son is better than the father. Father's just like begging for me. He's like, I don't need you.
That's my. Okay, describe, if you were to describe this man in one word, this man's personality in one word, what would you call him? Sad, anxious. Any others?
Overthinker.
Overthinker is a good one. Yeah, traditional.
That's a good one.
Okay, I'm gonna say loving as well. I think he's a loving father, even if he's maybe like a little too in his own head, right? How about the boy? We don't learn a whole lot about him, but the boy as he really is, like, what is the boy? What is one word you would use to describe the boy? Good. Any others? Young. Okay, good. So we've got these two characters, we've got this relationship between them, right? Try to pick one of these words for the man. Let's do the man first. Pick one of these words that you think best characterize the man and find 3 words in the poem. 3 words in the poem that support that reading of the man and circle them. So you're choosing one personality characteristic, finding 3 words in the poem that support that characteristic. All right, now if you were writing a paragraph about this man's characteristics, you'd want to unpack all of the words that you just circled, but choose one of the words that you just circled that you think is most interesting and talk about to the side the connotations of that word. Connotations are like the culturally agreed upon meanings of that word. And so it's like, what situation here, really briefly. What are some other words for this word, fact? Call them out.
Well,
Beautiful. Chubby.
Accept.
Interesting.
What? It's a real word.
Obese. What else? Heavy set. That's that one I've heard. What did you say? Blubby? Fluffy. Indulgent. I agree with that. How about overweight? How about if your girlfriend was a little bit overweight, what would you call her?
nothing, you say nothing.
Curvy. Beautiful, right? Exactly. But if you wouldn't, yeah, voluptuous.
Perfect, just the way she is.
Thick. All right. So, so let's say let's say you've got so your friend hands you her baby and you are holding it and it is a very fat baby, would you say, oh, your baby is fat? What would you call that baby?
Chubby.
Chubby, right? And you know that that's the word that you use because you're aware of the connotations of these different words. You wouldn't say, oh, this baby is overweight. Does not fit at all. It sounds like medical when you say it that way, right? Or you got an obese baby. No. And you guys knew right away what to say if it was a girl that you like a lot, that you are going to describe as a little bit fat, right? You're not going to say she's fat. No, you're going to say she's curvy. Right? You're going to say she's thick. It's something you like about her. If you are being very judgmental, you know that you would use the word indulgent. If you're talking about like yourself, maybe in a situation, trying to make fun of yourself, you might say, oh, I'm fluffy, or plump, right? Like plump is more like you're describing like a brute. Yeah, maybe a child, but also like kind of like maybe a cute old person.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But you see how they have these different kind of feels to them. When we're talking about connotation, it's like something that we've internalized in our language, but we know when certain words are appropriate for what situations and what kind of feel they have. Like we know chubby is a more positive word than obese, even though they might mean the same thing medically. So that's connotation. So see if you can choose one of the words that you chose to describe the man, and write down some of the connotations of that word. Like sad is an interesting one. Sad is not depressed. It's not morose. It's not, devastated. It's sad. It's a bad. Mhm. Yeah. Okay, and I think talking about this poem, it's pretty essential to talk about the narrative style in this poem because it is so unique. If you discover something in the poem they give you that really is unique, you got to touch on that. So the way that it uses italics here and it kind of switches back and forth between speaking or imagining or what have you. How would you describe the narration in this passage? Would you say first person, third person? First person limited, editorial, like how would you describe this narration? So when is it first person?
When he's talking kind of about his past, and, it's like don't go.
Okay, good, yeah. So the italics are all first person, right? But the italics, we might also say that they are dialogue, both real dialogue and imagined dialogue. When the boy says not the same story, Baba, a new one, that is real dialogue. When we go into the past or when we go into the future and it says already the man lives far ahead, that's kind of imagined dialogue inside of the man's head, right? But I think the whole passage still stays third person. Even when the man is imagining what is in the future, he says, but the boy is packing his shirts, is looking for his key. Already the man lives far ahead. Like it's talking about him in the third person, right? It's not already I live far ahead. So it's third person the whole time with these bits of both real and imagined dialogue. But it does seem to kind of go into the guy's head and represent what his thoughts are. So one way you could say that is there's a center of consciousness in the poem. The man is the center of consciousness in the poem. So it's like third person narration still, but it's limited. We only know what the man is feeling. We don't know what the boy is feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, because when it's italicized, it says let me and am I, or that I should.
Yeah, right. Right, and that's the imagined dialogue part, right? Yeah, okay, good. Now, next one. So you've got imagery, you've got characterization. In some poems, this is more important than in this poem, but you're gonna look at setting too. What is interesting about where it is set? And descriptive detail about the setting. Okay, this one has very little detail about the setting. It's an implied setting, but because it's implied, we might not want to spend all that much time on setting, right? So this is like that problem that we sometimes run into where we're trying to like make too much of what is not actually there in the poem. Like we're like, well, I imagine that they're sitting on the bed, it's story time, so he's probably about to fall asleep, and all of this kind of like speculation about what it is. But I don't know what it is, but the poem has a reason for not dwelling on the setting, right? There's not much in there. It says there's a room full of books, so there is a little bit of setting detail. It says he's waiting in his lap, so we know that they are sitting somewhere. We imagine they're inside, but I would say don't get too caught up on talking about what isn't in the poem. Focus on what is in the poem, so not so much speculation.
I also think that the way that the poem chooses not to talk about setting is important because it's more about what he's thinking.
That's a great point. So the setting might be inside his head more than anything else. Yeah, great point. Okay, but some poems, like, we did one once about like this guy going into the woods in the Caribbean and like learning a story with firelight and fireflies and all of that. It's like almost your whole essay will be about setting because the poems decided it would be. So let the poem guide your discussion on that. If there aren't any characters, if it's all setting, talk about setting. If there's characters and it's obvious that it's all about characterization, talk about the characters. Okay, next up, this is the part that we need to review quite a lot, which is the structure of the poem. This is like all of that iambic, trochaic, and epestic stuff. This is stanzas, enjambments, and caesuras. So first up, take a look at the stanza length. Stanza is each little, it's almost like the paragraph of the poem, right? So talk to each other. What can you tell each other about the significance of stanza length? Because this poet has decided to break these paragraphs up, these stanzas up where like kind of randomly. So what can you say about the stanza length? Talk to each other.
So at the beginning of the story, I think we all really short. But as it starts to open up, it gets longer and it just kind of shows like as it gets longer, the more yeah. And like so artwork thing is shorter, that makes it sound like and then it gets longer again. Maybe it's yeah, back into the reality. But he's still a little bit.
All right, so there's the stanzas. Now you can look at anything unusual about the structure that stands out right away. In this case, it's italics. So discuss, why do you think the poet used italics rather than quotation marks to show dialogue? That's how we usually do it. So why use italics instead? Talk together.
Yeah. And it gets more but when it is yeah, so that would be hard. The reader doesn't know.
I just thought you were testifying.
Okay, now you're going to look for what's called enjambment. You'll remember this is the one where it's like the line continues onto the next line without a pause. So to discover this, you can't rely on punctuation because poets are unreliable with punctuation. They'll do what they want with punctuation. Instead, you got to think, if I were to read this sentence out loud, would I need to continue on without any kind of pause? So if you look at that first line, sad is the man who asked for a story and can't come up with one. I exaggerated it, but you would kind of naturally pause there, right? Even though there's no comma because of that coordinating conjunction. So that one's not a strong example of enjambment. But if you go to the third stanza and you see in a room full of books in a world of stories, you wouldn't say in a room full of books in a world of stories. That sounds awkward, right? So that would be a good example of enjambment. So that was one. Find another example of enjambment in there. Okay, now you got to tell each other about why it uses the enjambment. So let me give you an example of this because it's always different. It can always be like really nuanced. But I think the one where it says not one and soon he thinks the boy will give up on his father. In that same stanza, that whole stanza is enjambment, like every line. To me, that one is really interesting that it breaks up the he thinks and the will give up on his father. So that if you were to just look at that line, will give up on his father, it seems secure. It seems like, I mean, I have anxiety, so this is so familiar to me. Like you go to that next line and you're like, oh yeah, and you forget that you're thinking and you're just like, that is what will happen, you know, like he will give up on me. And it kind of separates that from the thinking part, which shows that this was subjective, that this is a story he is telling himself in his mind. And so here it's like to break that up kind of shows how the anxiety is becoming more and more like he feels like it's a sure thing, like you can't avoid these bad results that will happen from his one mistake of not knowing the story, you know? So see if you can say something about why the poet used another instance of enjambment. Talk to each other about it.
Can recall.
So the voice actually
I'll just do the one above, like,
and it's the natural process, like the line. A voice in his head, and
like it.
I think he does that because if he put it together, like the voice and it's like sort of like combination. Because the writer wants them.
Yeah.
The voice.
Okay, next up, you're going to look for caesura. Those are the pauses in the middle of the line. And for it to count for caesura, you need it to be kind of a substantial pause, either between two independent clauses or between two sentences. So like, for example, in the second stanza, the man rubs his chin, scratches his ear. There's a comma in the middle of that line, but it's not this really substantial pause because it's listing his actions. So we wouldn't call that one a caesura. But if you go to the fourth stanza and it says that the day this boy will go, period, don't go, that's definitely a caesura because there would be a really significant pause there. So find another caesura and then talk together again about why that would be significant to the meaning of the poem, to have that break right in the middle of the line like that.
I did. But the voice here. So it's like-
No way. We're just on the same
Realistic
line.
and like,
Just
it's
that.
something that would.
When I was in Michelle, That's what I thought. She was like, "Yeah, just ask Tristan."
And then the same.
I'm gonna pass.
Alex again, right after. They're all like Alex. And then it goes. Normal dialogue. And then commas, yeah, like send you. Doesn't, yeah. And then the last name I said. You. And then. There's no.
Okay, the other thing you can look for is end stopped lines, like when it actually has the pause at the end of the line. I will say that's harder to write about unless you are writing about the juxtaposition between these. So if you're like, if the poem, because it's more normal, I guess, for a poem to have just a bunch of end stopped lines. So it doesn't always have a lot of significance to talk about that. But if there's a lot of enjambment and then a very clearly in stopped line, you could talk about how those contrast. Right. Okay. Next category would be sound. So we've got structure. We'll talk about meter here in a minute. Sound is a good one to look at. So first, find some alliteration. What is alliteration again? Both vowels and consonants, put them together, but at the beginning of the word. So alliteration is repeated sounds at the beginning of the word, consonants or vowels. So find an example of alliteration. Is there any? I haven't looked for this. Oh, yeah, sure. And they don't have to be right in a row. You're kind of looking for them within a line or within two lines.
What do you mean?
Yes. So second line. It says can't come up with one, and you've got the k sound repeating in can't and come right at the beginning of the words. That would be alliteration. Yeah. Or same story. Or if I took yours. Okay, let's put all of these together. Now look for some consonants. Consonants is when consonant sounds repeat, but it doesn't have to be at the beginning of the word. So it can be anywhere, anywhere in the sentence. Let's see if I can. Sad is, just the first two lines has some consonants because sad and is both have the S sound in it, right? So look and see if you can find some consonants in the poem. Screams, mute. Got some consonants. Okay, and while you're looking for that, you can also look for some assonants. That is the repetition of vowel sounds. So sad man, that's got some assonants in it when you repeat that ass sound. Okay, once you look for those kind of repeated sounds, there's two ways to talk about that. One, you can talk about how it contributes to the tone. So if there's like a whole bunch of sounds repeating over the course of the poem, it kind of can create a crackling kind of atmosphere to it, a kind of spiky feel to it. Whereas if it's got a lot of long vowel sounds, it feels more melodic, it feels more calming then. Like you can talk about how sound is contributing to the actual feel of the poem, or I could say tone or atmosphere. You can also talk about how it adds to the meaning. That's a little bit harder to do, but the way to do that is by looking at how it pairs words up. So if there is a bunch of words in a row that all start with C, you can think about how that means that this poet wanted us to think about all these words together. For example, in the last stanza, it says it's an emotional rather than a logical equation, so that emotional and equation are alliteration, right? And so I could talk about how, all right, it's interesting that he wants to combine this word that's like really associated with like math and like calculated thinking with equation, but he wants to add that to emotion, which is like another way of, I don't know, highlighting the irony of the poem to me, that an equation could be emotional. It feels like an oxymoron a little bit. Oxymoron is like when two words contradict each other, like jumbo shrimp is always the one that we use, you know? So emotional equation feels like that to me. It feels like he creates that with the alliteration. So you could talk about it through pairing, how it creates meaning, or how it creates tone and atmosphere. Talk to each other about one instance of these sound repetitions, about how it might do that.
Absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Uh-huh.
But is the word shrimp before they name the animal, or do we use that word like, oh, you're so shrimpy because of the animal?
I'll look it up. I don't know. That's a really good question.
There is a way to end sound.
Okay, I've got your answer. So it started in the German Schrimpen, which means to wrinkle,
Oh.
and then it became to contract, and so it became to mean small. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, it became like a way of saying like you're like compacted basically. And then it makes sense then that they named the little animal that, because the animal is so like wrinkled and gross. Yeah. So small first and then animal. Shrimp tastes delicious. Shrimpen. Yeah. Okay, so that sound, you can also find some rhyme, and there's all different kinds of rhyme words, which we will look at next time when we review, because there's the I rhymes and the internal rhyme and the slant rhyme. There's all these different kinds of rhymes, and this poem does not rely on rhyme at all. I would not necessarily talk about rhyme in this poem because it's like very clearly like not utilizing rhyme, I don't think, unless you see some. Yeah.
Do you argue or like tell people about how it's more of a free verse and
Yes.
that matches his thought, like his thinking process?
That's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah. So the absence of rhyme in that case, but in that case, you're not talking about the absence of rhyme. You're talking about what it is, which is free verse. Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, last one is another one that we're not going to look at too closely for this poem. We'll look at it more next time, but that is meter. That's the pattern, right? So any metrical patterns where you're looking at stresses. All right. And it's going to be pretty obvious when you look at a poem whether or not it's got any meter to it, right? So this one, kind of like, sad is the man who asks for a story and can't come up with one. That does kind of sound a little metrical, but then as you go forward, his 5-year-old son waits in his lap, not the same story, Baba, a new one. The man rubs his chin, scratch, it starts to not be metrical anymore, right? And I think for the rest of it would be very hard to talk about meter. However, if you do want to talk about that first bit, why do you think they make that first bit sound so melodic? Yeah.
Because like then like at the beginning of the story, he like kind of knows what he's doing, but then he loses it as like the story goes on. And then we were talking about how the stanzas like get bigger and bigger as he starts to overthink, and then all of a sudden it gets smaller when he feels like really sad, and then it gets bigger again.
Okay, I like this idea, so that it's like, it's sort of when he feels in control, maybe it's in control and then he becomes out of control. Yeah, there's also, do you notice how there's that first phrase is like kind of inverted in a very formal way? Sad is the man who is asked for a story and can't come up with one. Like it almost feels like a parable a little bit then, like it's setting up a fable, or it's like this announcement of what the poem is going to be about. So that's the point. Like it feels like at that point we are not in the man's consciousness. It's like this is the narrator saying this is what the poem will be about, and that makes sense that that's more formal than the actual story.
It sounds like the quote at the beginning of the movie.
Yes.
It's like, it's just kind of relating, almost like a theme, I guess, giving the theme before it starts.
I totally see that. Yeah. Or like the fable at the end of an Aesop's fable when it says the moral of the story is. I agree. It's like exactly like this little prologue to the poem. I like that. Okay. Other than that, I would say probably if you're going to talk about meter, talk about how it's free verse, not metered, right? So it's what I'm trying to get us to do here, and what I'm stressing is talk about what is there. Try not to speculate too much about what is not there. So focus on the language that's in front of you, say things about the words that are on the page, and you'll be in better shape that way. The other thing that I want to focus on is, did you see how we started with images, characters, settings? We started with the storytelling aspects of the poem, and then we moved into the structural aspects and thinking about the sound and the stanzas and all of that. That is a good way to think about how to approach the poem. They want to see that you do know these literary devices for poems, like you know these poetic devices and you can talk about them, but you're prioritizing what the poem actually means. And so sometimes I'll get paragraphs where it'll be like, this is what it sounds like. And so I'm making all of these great observations about the sound, but without saying, it sounds like this in these words, and these words have this meaning for the poem, it gets lost. I don't know if this is making sense, but like I'll have people say, okay, it's an iambic meter, right? And so it shows that he's very comfortable. It shows that he's like, this setting is very regular. It's very controlled. But then there will be nothing in the essay that says, it also says that it's controlled just in the way the character interacts with their setting, which is way more substantial. So flip that order. Talk about how the character is, comfortable in their setting or anxious in their setting in this case. Talk about how the man is anxious in the setting, and look at all the words and all the evidence in the actual words that show his anxiety, and then talk about free verse and say, look, that is echoed in the form. So story first, then form. That doesn't mean you ignore form. Say something about form, point out alliteration, point out the poetic devices, but really prioritize story devices. Yeah.
It's like what you focus on, like the other stuff.
Yes, that's a great way of looking at it. Yeah. Okay, with that in mind, for your thesis statements for poems, you want a theme plus devices. And your devices, try to combine either at least one formal device with one, let's call it story device, like literary device. So, something about the characters, but also something about the sounds, something about the structure of it, but also something about the images, try and fit at least one of those things from both sides of our devices for a poem. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes now. We've talked about this poem so much. You can choose how you want to focus it. You could talk about any of these things that you talked about in your groups, but see what your thesis would be for this one. Pretend you are actually taking the test now. What would your thesis be about this poem? Okay, I'm going to give you 4 minutes to write your thesis. Kind of looks like everybody's finished, so I'm gonna cut us off. All right, let's pretend, I just wrote this very quickly, but let's pretend this is my thesis. It's the same idea as with your short passage essays. You want to try and break up the essay by theme and developing the theme rather than by poetic strategies. So in this one, I have shifting time frame, free verse, and then I fit in my idea about irony here. I don't want to have then a 5-paragraph essay where it's here's my shifting timeline, here's my free verse, here's my irony paragraph, right? Instead, I want to think about how to move through the poem with the reader. It's almost like I'm taking the reader on a journey. Oh my gosh, this is so corny, but I'm taking the reader on a journey through the poem, and I am showing them as we walk through the poem, I'm pointing out everything along the way that helps to prove that this theme is actually the theme of this poem, right? So when I'm looking at my theme, I want to talk about the pressures of love first. Pressure in the relationship between between the boy and father. I want to talk then about how it's love, but no, let's go with overwhelming. That pressure becomes overwhelming, and this person becomes super, super anxious. But this is so ironic because love is so wonderful. And then I've kind of taken us through the poem. Like I'll start with son asks the father a story. I will go to, oh my gosh, there's so many books, there's so many stories, I don't know what to say. I will go to shifting time frames and how he looks in the future and he's like, oh my gosh, he's going to leave me someday. But then this last equation, the last stanza, how he focuses on the equation of love. So I kind of move through the poem as I'm proving my theme. Okay, with that in mind, try and give yourself now a little bit of a structure for your hypothetical essay, just to be clear, you're not having to write this. I don't do this ahead of time, just to be clear. When I write these timed essays, I write a little thesis on the prompt. I write a tiny little outline on the prompt to help me remember where I'm going. It just depends on if you want to do that, if it helps you. I don't write this part, but I want to show you guys how this would work. This means that I'm not just limited to talking about the poetic devices that I mentioned here. I want to stress these poetic devices, but if other things come in and I want to mention that something is a metaphor or something is alliteration, I am free to do that with this structure. So in the first part, I'll talk about dialogue and italics. Second part, I'll talk about free verse. Third part, I will talk about shifting timelines. Fourth part, I'm going to talk about the irony and the parable formality at the beginning.
Wait, you can talk about things not.
You could talk about poetic devices that aren't in your thesis. You're highlighting these things, like this is where you're going to spend the most of your time. But if in highlighting this, like when you have a quote that shows that the time frame shifts, and if it includes alliteration, you can add in a little sentence about the alliteration in it. Yeah. Okay, before you put that away, I want the green ones now so that I can see. Will you just put a star next to your thesis statement so I can take a look at it? And I did give you feedback on your thesis and paragraph from last time, and it's over in your crate over there in your folder. I should have told you that at the beginning of class, but it's there. And that is all.